Mikhail, I might look young, but I've lived enough to know that the Islamic Republic cannot reform until the supreme leader is alive. And that's a scenario you didn't talk about. I agree with you, revolution doesn't seem possible at this stage. But reform also seems impossible. And the reason for that is that we have tried at least 20 years.
Just because reform doesn't seem possible right now, that does not support the opposition. The motion is, this House believes the Islamic Republic of Iran can reform, but it doesn't specify a time frame. All the proposition have to show...
Yes, at some point in the next 200 years.
In the next millennium.
Only one member speaking at a time. You've had your point of information.
So there are two pillars to the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's hostility towards the West and Sharia law. For reform in the Islamic Republic, we need to see those things changed. If you take either of these things away, then you don't have an Islamic Republic. You can call it something else, but to think that the Islamic Republic of Iran can reform is, in my opinion, naive. You used the example of US-Iran deal. That wasn't a sign of reform. It was out of desperation. Because severe sanctions as a result of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's rhetoric against the West, specifically against Israel, and several rounds of sanctions imposed by Obama administration put the Iranian economy at a point that they could no longer breathe. That's why the supreme leader allowed Hassan Rouhani to run for presidency, and that was his main promise, and he managed to deliver. Was he looking to reform the Islamic Republic? No. And then one factor that you're ignoring are the hardliners inside the country. And I want to give you a bit of political context. I would like to divide the history of the Islamic Republic into two sections. First was the first 20 years. The revolution has happened. They were trying to establish themselves. Iran-Iraq war happened. There were mass executions of political dissidents. And then there were, after the Iran-Iraq war, President Rafsanjani was very busy trying to rebuild the country and the economy that was in ruins. In 1997, Mohammad Khatami arrived. For the first time, he was talking about free press. He was talking about free speech. He was talking about reform. And everybody was glued to their TVs. And they voted for him. It was a shock victory, both for him and the supreme leader. The supreme leader was not expecting him to win. Neither did Mr. Khatami himself. There were a window, 2 years window, which everything looked great. We had free newspapers, we had reformist newspapers. Many books that were banned from being published until then were allowed to be published. But that window, that 2-year window, was shut because of the supreme leader, because he ordered that those newspapers had to be shut down. So many journalists lost their jobs. Students went out on the street. They were violently cracked down as usual. So that was our window. But the Iranian people didn't lose hope. So in that sense, I agree with you. The Iranian people do want reform, and that's why they're still fighting, and that's why they're still protesting. But in fact, the supreme leader has become more confident over the years in suppressing any demand for change, in using more violence. Every round of protests, we see more violence, more death, more arrests. And more recently, he actually was confident enough to say that the Iranian people cannot analyze Iranian politics. That's why they can't take part in a referendum. And that was a response to Mir Hossein Mousavi, the former prime minister, who has been under house arrest for 12 years. Why house arrest? Because he's too afraid to have a trial. Because he doesn't believe in reform. And to be honest, even his own supporters don't believe in reform. They believe that this regime is perfect. They want to keep the status quo. And that's why so he allowed Khatami to be elected in 1997, to his shock. And he wasn't confident enough to meddle with the election in 2001. So President Khatami was elected, which again is a sign that the Iranians did favor his reformist view, but then Khamenei learned his lesson. So that was a bit complex in 2001, because People were disappointed because Khatami was unable to deliver many of the promises thanks to hardliners and the supreme leader. So the turnout was quite low, but many believe that the election in 2005, which resulted in Ahmadinejad's victory, was rigged. So was 2009. Millions of people came out on the street. They were still believing in reform. They didn't want a revolution.
Point of information. Did not the US and Iran briefly, for a period of time after 9/11, work together to strike the Taliban in support of the Northern Alliance? Because the Taliban, as you know, are no friends of Shias. They're a radical Sunni supremacist group. Did not that help US-Iranian relations? Could not that have been a chance for real internal reform?
There are so many examples like that, including the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. So there are tactical moments that Iran believes that there is a common enemy, let's negotiate and let's work together with the US. But the supreme leader has a long history of animosity against the United States, and he's also famous for holding grudges. He's an unforgiving individual. That is why the former Prime Minister Mousavi is still under house arrest, and this goes back to a feud that they had at the beginning of the revolution. So he's not the type of person who would change tact. And that's why I don't believe until he's alive there will be reform. Yes, nobody knows who will replace him, and that can really change the course of Iran's history. But until then, it's very naive to think that it will change. Even Prime Minister Mousavi, during the recent protests, gave a statement in which he said, we have to move on from this regime. So at this point, I think even the supporters of the regime know that reform is not happening. I agree with you that revolution is also impossible. I don't want to be a pessimist. I'm a relatively young Iranian, and I hope for change, and I hope for reform, and I hope for a peaceful transition of power. And I don't want to be bleak, but I want to be realistic. Change will happen. You mentioned internal pressure, the increased internal pressure and external. I think we have witnessed that. Internal pressure is at the highest level, and external pressure is also extremely high. But don't forget the alliances that the Islamic Republic have created in the region. Now, after 7 years of not having any diplomatic relations with the Saudis, there was a shock announcement that they are restoring diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. And then they have this long-standing coalition with Russia and China. So even when it comes to external pressure, i.e. sanctions, our options are limited. And lastly, looking at now, 2023, President Raisi was elected in 2021 in a sham election because Supreme Leader learned that it's too risky to allow people to choose. So the way he runs the show now is that he makes sure that people who have any inclination or any similarities between them and the reformists don't even get to run. So they are handpicked by the Supreme Leader to run. So that little chance of people to have a say, to choose an elected leader, is now gone. And he's now created a committee which is called the Committee of the Leaders of the three branches of power. They go and sit in a room and they make a decision, for example, to triple the price of oil without consultation with the parliament, and they just announce it. Next day there are protests. People across the country come out on the street, they get killed. So over the years, it's got much worse. Every step we took towards reform, we were pushed back. And every step we go further, we're pushed back. I admire all those who are protesting on the street. They're young and they have hope. And culturally, there has been a revolution because we see that on the streets. Brave men and women are going out on the streets, and now men are supporting women. But when it comes to political change and political reform, we have a very long way to go. Thank you.